Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the second of our Hear from the Masters Dolby Atmos webinar series. And so we're going to give it another minute or so because we still see quite a few attendees joining the room. We had several hundred RSVPs. And so as soon as I see the number kind of start to level off, we'll get things started proper. I'm hearing music. Where's music coming from?
Yeah, I do too. Yeah.
I do too. I don't think it's me.
It's very relaxing.
You all might hear my kids once in a while.
You will definitely hear my family.
You might hear scratching. That would be my kid's guinea pig in the other room.
Aw.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So again, this is the second instance of our Hear from the Masters webinar series. I'm going to talk about the one we already did, as well as the ones we have coming up at the end of this series. But let's introduce the panel, and I'm really glad and humbled to say they're all good friends of mine. Our first guest, he's a Renaissance man who worked early in his career at Prince's Paisley Park Studios and has deep experience mixing music as well as episodic series and features. He was one of the pioneers in mixing Dolby Atmos for home, including Netflix's feature Okja, and has been a go-to artist for remixing channel-based features from multiple major studio titles into Atmos, excuse me, including films from the John Wick and Hunger Games franchises, and he remixed one of the earliest episodic series for Atmos, HBO's Game of Thrones. He's the business client whose name I have to be most careful spelling, Minnesota's own Tim Hogenacker.
Hi.
Audience for applause here. So our next guest, I've known her longer than just about anybody else I know in this industry. We both started together as baby editors at Henninger Video in Arlington, Virginia, and now as the owner and head mixer at Odd House Audio in Silver Spring, Maryland. She mixes prestige broadcast, museum, and feature documentary content too numerous to mention for PBS, BET, Smithsonian, Discovery, and National Geographic. And she had the foresight and vision to install the very first Dolby Atmos for home mix room in the U.S. East Coast. The pride of Maryland, Cheryl Ottenritter. Again, hold for And finally, with dozens of major feature films under his belt, including highly regarded dramas like Crash, hit comedies like Bridesmaids, and horror features like the 2009 reboot of Friday the 13th, and recently the 2019 Best Episodic Immersive Mix co-winner from the Advanced Imaging Society for Amazon's steampunk fantasy series Carnival Row, Motion Picture Academy member, and my frequent expense account lunch pal, Mark Fishman.
Morning, everybody.
Hey.
So everyone who joined us, again, thank you all so much for coming on. We will be doing questions after we do a little bit of conversation ourselves. Please go ahead and use that questions panel to enter them. And I have a colleague monitoring that, and we'll be going down that list probably in the latter half hour. So everyone, good morning. And what you doing these days? These are strange times, and but it sounds, in our chat yesterday, like you're all keeping busy. Are you all working from home, mixing at your studios? What's the business like these days?
Well, I'll go. I've probably been about 70–80% busy. So I'm been pretty busy for the most part, considering all the weirdness going on. And I, Formosa only has a very small number of stages that are available. All the other facilities are closed, so we're all kind of fighting for whatever stages are available. So it's an interesting time.
Yep. And but you're primarily at the office. You don't really take work home or do pre-dubs or anything like that on headphones or
yeah, it's pretty much all there at the facilities.
Wow.
Yeah.
And Cheryl, you actually just moved down the street into a brand new facility, and you just kicked the doors open just in time for things to get weird. What are you doing these days?
Well, we planned our new studio around working from home, remote work. On my team, we have studios in our house. Mine is the one that's not finished, of course. And we all network all our media so we can share media just like that. And it's working really well. It's working really well. I do go to the shop, just me and the faders, when I really need a room, a room, bigger room, Atmos or 5.1, and it's working really well actually. And we've been fairly busy actually. I feel kind of almost ashamed to say it, not ashamed but guilty that so many people are out of work, and we're here just chugging along. I think we put out 12 shows during the Corona time. Yeah.
And because you like to challenge yourself, you also just completed rebuilding your home in addition to moving your
Yeah,
facility.
I don't, I'm just, I like punishment. I like punishment. That's why the room downstairs isn't finished yet. We went right from finishing our house to building a new studio. And then the next stage is finishing the downstairs studios. So,
Well, tell us about that. How do you plan to kind of divide the labor between what you can do at home and what you can do at the office?
dialogue editing, some sound design, stereo mixes, because I do a lot of that still. People are still in stereo land. So I do a lot of that at home, and then I take it to the shop and I finish it out in the Atmos room or the 5.1 room. But it's actually working really well, and you learn how to translate. You learn how it all translates pretty easily. It starts to flow after a while, and you really understand what you're hearing, where, and how it applies.
Got it. Thanks. Mark, how about yourself?
Well, I'm kind of the outlier. Things haven't really changed for me. I've actually been at Formosa this whole time. We had a bunch of shows that were continuing and starting up in the middle of this. And as Tim said, Formosa has had a really small footprint. So for me, it's been a little strange, but I've been at Formosa the whole time mixing. We're doing all of our shows are Atmos that I've been working on so far this year. So we've kind of stayed here to finish shows without clients and a very small footprint. But as far as the mixing part of it, it's been no different for me, which is kind of strange.
Yep. And are you working mostly on features or episodic? What's the bulk of your work these days?
Mostly episodic. I'm doing my first feature that I've done in a long time for Netflix, but it's a feature film. We're in the middle of that right now, mixing in Atmos, and but primarily it's been broadcast over the top stuff.
Yep. All right. Tim, tell me about the main room you mostly work in. You started in mix, I forget if it's 1 or A at Formosa Santa Monica, and then you went over to 2B, and it's a little bit more space, but
they call them studios. Yeah, Studio A, Studio B, and so Santa Monica location is Studio B, which is it's a smaller to mid-sized room with a Meyer surrounds, Meyer Atmos system, and I miss the room because I've now been working in Hollywood for during this whole pandemic, and but it's it's a powerful room.
Yep, excellent. And since you got your S6, you used to joke that you primarily mix in the box like mouse and keyboard, and that your console was actually just an expensive bus router.
I used to work on an AMS Neve DFC Gemini for years, many years, and it got to be the point where it was a sexy stem router. It was just I did everything within the box, but it had great metering.
Nice. Now that you're on your S6, do you find you're actually using the console more and like using the touchscreen to pan things around, or are you still primarily mouse and keyboard? Yeah,
definitely. Still a lot of mouse and keyboard. Of course, have to have faders. But with the S6, I'm definitely reaching for knobs more because it's just easier. It's just you can move things quicker in closer range. So,
sure.
So I'm, it's when I would work on an icon, I definitely wasn't hitting the knobs as much. I was hitting more mouse. But the S6, I'm moving around more. I'm getting more exercise.
Okay, right. And Cheryl, your new room, how's it feeling? How's everything fitting? You just got your new subwoofer after the last one caught fire.
Oh man, it went up in smoke. I literally, it was fire. So the insurance company said, oh, here's some money. So we're not really ready to get off our blue skies yet, financially, after all the build out and all the infrastructure building that we're doing, but next year. So I'm gonna pick you guys' brains on that when we get there. But so we picked the Dyne, the Core Audio Professional sub, and Jeremy's installing it today. I can't wait to go hear it. I have an S6, and I definitely am a hybrid too. I use a lot of mice, a lot of keyboard, but faders and the monitors, and it really makes me a lot faster, the S6. We have DADs for the monitoring and a lot of Dante going on in the new shop. We wired for Dante everywhere. So that's kind of where we're at right now with the new room. And I really love, in my old Atmos suite, it was a little too low. The ceiling was just a little too low. So the room is just slightly bigger than my old Atmos room, and yet the imaging is so much better. So that's what I really love about the new room, is the imaging.
Yeah, and you've been used to your blue skies. You've mixed on those for quite some time, right?
I have actually. When I first went out on my own, I had Dyne Audios, and I felt that my mixes for broadcast weren't holding up, so I did a shootout, and I went with blue skies at that time.
Mhm.
But it's definitely needs to make a transition sometime next year, I think.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I really
And
like them.
yeah, and Mark, you do you move around a bit, or have you kind of settled into one room these days, or what? Where typically are you working?
Well, no, Formosa has 3 general facilities: Santa Monica, Hollywood, and North Hollywood, and it's a combination of S6s and icons, and we just go wherever the clients are. So, for Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist, we mixed in Santa Monica. For Little Fires Everywhere, we did that in Hollywood. So we're jumping around quite a bit. They have a really interesting way of working where every mixer has their own boot drive. So we just kind of walk around, you plug your boot drive in, and you're on the same Pro Tools and all that. So it's really just balancing the motor memory from the icon to the S6 on any given day. But they've done a really good job of making sure all the rooms translate.
Yep.
And it's been a really cool experience doing that. And I'm probably 90% on the console. The one thing I usually go to the mouse for is actually panning in Atmos.
Yeah.
I'm a lot more comfortable doing it with the mouse than I am with the console.
Okay. And correct me if I'm wrong. I think Cheryl and Tim, you do single operator mixes, but Mark, you work frequently as part of a team, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's always me doing dialogue and music, and then a sound effects background Foley mixer. And yeah, we've done that for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And has Atmos changed the how the two of you work together in terms of the division of labor and session tracking, things like that?
Not necessarily, but the one thing I find myself paying a lot more attention to is when I can see that they're doing something with objects, or we're talking about putting something in the ceiling or on the sides and the back. I start getting out of the way a little bit more than I used to think about it when we were doing strictly channel-based mixes. And sometimes we'll have those conversations about what's going to work, or am I getting in the way a little bit more, and making a little bit more room for them, where it used to be you'd kind of let things fight and poke through. Now we're trying to make some space.
Yep. All right. So I had a pre-written question. It actually mirrors a question that one of our visitors asked. So just to kind of break down the fundamental structure of Atmos, how you use beds versus objects for the different food groups like music and effects, and when you use static versus motion objects to create your 3D spaces, what's kind of your general philosophy of beds versus objects, and then again also static objects versus motion objects? I know that's like 10 questions in one there, but Tim, let's go back to you. How do you use the overall structure of an Atmos mix?
So I guess it kind of starts with a little bit of my theory behind it, and that I'm always, and I've said this before about how I'm not always all about the hard effects panning with the helicopters. I mean, yes, obviously that goes default to have that, but to me it's also about music and backgrounds, ambiences, because that I actually will put on a pile of objects for sure. And they're more static, of course, but just because you get more space in that dimension, and especially because it's and especially of course with theatrical, even more so, just to get all those different elements, spaced about. Dialogue and Foley, I would keep in a bed for the most part. Never really leaves that much. And but so as far as objects, it's pretty much, it's music, backgrounds, effects. And then sometimes I'll keep Wallas and group on a separate bed only, just to leave more room for objects.
Yep. All right. And when you do music ambiences, like you do a fair amount of music mixing, do you use if something is sitting in space, do you typically use the bed space, or do you use static objects around the room to kind of fill out the mix? What's your approach there?
Well, part of it is how many depends on how many objects I have available, how much are available compared to all the other ones that are taking up that room. If it's for a feature or a series or something like that, then if usually you get pretty good amount of wide music stems to spread out. And me, and I think a lot of mixers probably do this too, where it's the more fluid instrumentation would go more in the surrounds, like the strings and and an organ or something might go more in the surrounds, and then but I keep more percussion up front for the most part. That's more on the feature side. Now, and I've done some music Atmos projects, music only projects, and those, of course, you go a little bit wilder on. You can expand a little further. And so that'll pull things out in the room a little bit more, still keeping vocals and, kick and snare on that kind of stuff up front, but
right.
But they, the reverbs and fluid stuff around, if that answers that.
It does, yeah. Cheryl, what's your general approach? Do you, and doing more documentary type work, you probably do more of your own sound design and then moving into mix versus editors cutting things for you and then you opening up the session and seeing how they've tracked it out, what they've put in the bed tracks, what they've put in objects. What's your approach to building mix?
I tend to do a lot of groups and a lot of different beds, and sometimes with dialogue, and definitely if it's a narrative, an LCR bed instead of a full across the board bed, just to save room for objects. And then I've started putting almost all of my sound effects on mono object tracks, just so that it gives me the freedom down the road to do whatever I want with them. Ambiences, usually can go to a bed, but what I started doing is moving away from the thought that, this, like Tim was saying, the static bed, and adding ambiences in different ways, with whether it's size or texture, to add to that feel, that true feel. Instead of it, you didn't want to just put everything in the 7.1, make sure that you feel it in that sound bed. And that's really where Atmos really comes alive for docs, is the texture that you can add to a mix. And then I do a lot with groups, because at the end of the day, I want to hit that render button, that re-render button, and just have all my splits and everything come out at the end. So I do a lot of groups, especially with, you asked me earlier about NATs. I almost always have a NAT bed and then also a dialogue object. So that, like, if they're moving around, like say in the river and the wall, when they were taking a journey through, horses and streams and canoes and everywhere, it allowed me to actually move them around a little bit, even though of course you want them center focused. Sometimes it's really nice to feel the group move by you. So it takes a lot of work to do that, but it really makes the documentary come alive.
Thanks. And Mark, for you probably do, some of your bigger effects heavy shows. Do they come to you already sound designed to a certain extent, where the object tracking budget is kind of laid out, like this many for dialogue, this many for music, this many for effects? Or what are your sessions, how are they structured?
Sure. I use almost exclusively 7.1 beds for everything, except sometimes on some shows, I'm still a big fan of using the 9.1 beds for music, and using the overhead stereo arrays, and panning up into them. As far as allocating for objects, I kind of use a hybrid approach where I have a couple of 7-channel aux buses in Pro Tools that switch between my beds and then my objects. And even though those then 7-channel aux ends, they're usually pre-panned and they're kind of static, at any point too, I can just grab one of those objects and make it into a mono object. You kind of think of it that way, and then we'll move those around within those auxes. And so that way I don't ever have to think about if I want to have something as an object. So I don't ever use object tracks or anything. I just use automated aux busing inside Pro Tools. And then I can still grab any one of those 7 objects that are static at any point and then move them around if I need to, and do that. And much like Tim, I'll use these 7-channel ambience for music, or for ambiences or delays in dialogue, and kind of pan through those and let those sit static, but actually use the plugins and stuff to move through those 7 objects.
Okay. Yeah, so 3 very different approaches, and it's interesting, and I even know of other approaches from other studios. We have a question that's kind of in a similar vein. Do you have an object budget? And I'll just answer that. I know of like animation studios, they'll use objects extensively for dialogue, because it makes it very easy for foreign language versioning. And you will actually see spreadsheets with each character laid out and what object number they're assigned to. I won't say which studio it is. It rhymes with Schmixar. But it makes it easy to take that Atmos M&E, with all of the dialogue object panning data and then send it to the international territories. And all they have to do is slug in the international language tracks, and it makes it very easy to remix those foreign dubs. So I hope that answered the question that was in the chat. But let's see here. So Cheryl, you mentioned briefly doing bouncing out to channel-based deliverables. Once you do your Atmos mix, you still want it to translate well to re-rendered 5.1 or stereo. How much customization or tweaking or maybe compromising the Atmos mix do you have to do in order to achieve not only a great Atmos mix, but also a great sounding 5.1 or stereo to accommodate all the different consumer setups?
Not much, because you know, I know that like 90% of the people are actually going to watch this documentary in stereo. So, and what I find that Atmos folds down really well or re-renders really well down to stereo. So I'm constantly monitoring in all the different channel-based formats while I'm mixing in Atmos. It's not just I'm focusing on Atmos and then going to do the stereo mix, just because that also find that saves me time on the back end. So, and a lot of times people still want, you know, remote reviews in stereo. So I have to accomplish that as well. So usually by the time I get to the end, I don't have to trim or use the trim functions because it's all there. If I do anything, I'll bring back in the stereo and the 5.1 or the 7.1 and do a little mastering on it just to make it punch a little bit more. But other than that, I don't really try to redo it, because also then when the Dolby master goes out, it's going to decode wherever you are. So I want to make sure that when it decodes, it still is going to play the way I hear it in stereo. So I don't know.
Okay, thanks. And same question to Mark and Tim, but also, you know, in the Dolby Atmos render, we actually designed, for those who don't know, we designed re-render trim controls where you can actually shade how the re-renders contribute. For example, if you find your surrounds are drowning out the dialogue, you can program in those metadata trims, and it doesn't affect the Atmos mix, but it does apply to the re-renders when it plays back in a consumer environment. So A, how do you do your channel-based read deliverables? And B, is anybody actually using those re-render trim controls, or do you not really find them necessary? Tim,
Well,
sorry.
Well, I guess I'm a little. I actually don't use the trims that really at all. I'm pretty much going by what the RMU is doing for down mixes out of the box. And I guess my theory on it is that it's, you know, when you're listening to an Atmos mix at home, somebody's listening to it on the receiver. Depending on how they're listening, they might be having an Atmos selected, but it might be down mixing to a 5.1 or a stereo on their system, whether it's incorrect or not. And so if I adjust trims for a render separately, that's not going to affect that portion of it. So it's kind of, you know, I try to, if I want to adjust something for 5.1, if there's, especially for 5.1 or stereo, and something's not really working right, I try to adjust it on the Atmos end, knowing that I can, you know, it's going to follow downstream for the most part. Try not to change the settings, because it does mimic what the chipsets of the receivers would do. You know, correct me if I'm wrong on that, Tom, but I think that's, yeah.
And Mark?
Well, yeah, you know, one of the things, doing broadcast, we don't ever have the time to do separate passes for 5.1 and 2-track. You know, we usually have 2 or 3 days on some of these shows and up to 4 or 5. So we've really learned to trust the RMU down mix, and it's evolved, it's gotten so good that sometimes we don't even listen to it. But a lot of times what we'll do is when we do one, or if we do 2 client playbacks, we usually play back one of them in 5.1 so we can hear it before it goes out. But we've been really trusting of the RMU to do that, and with the stereos also.
That's great. No,
to move on further, what Cheryl was saying too about, you know, I have the same setup where I'm constantly switching from Atmos to 5.1 and to stereo all the time. Like, in fact, it even kind of drives some clients crazy when I'm mixing with them. Flipping around, like, what are you doing? Oh, I'm just hearing how it down mixes. Okay, and so, but it's a crucial. You know, I even have my BSS controller actually have a mono button too. I want to hear things go to mono.
Exactly.
You know? Yeah.
I especially when I'm setting up what you all were talking about, the apron or the reverb for the music or any kind of reverb, I'm constantly going back and forth to hear if there's any, if I'm, causing any phase issues or any type of playback issues, masking. And I find that sometimes setting that up way before I even start digging into the mix, truly digging into the mix, like setting up the verbs and how do they fold down, saves me a lot of time, because then I'm not doing it all the time while I'm mixing. I just know what's working for that music or that voice or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And Cheryl, specifically in the documentary world, which I think you're the biggest specialist in the group here, like you said earlier, it's always good to use as much nat sound as you get from the field, but sometimes, I remember in one of your recent big projects, you actually didn't, everything came in MOS and you were like, super. So how do you do a sound effects design with Atmos in mind, specifically for documentaries, where you want to actually be true to the piece rather than kind of creating artificial drama? What's kind of the line you tread there?
Well, it has to be real. It has to feel real. And with Atmos, you can place, animals or gnats or anywhere in the sound field. So that helps a lot. And if you're lacking gnats, which you usually are, no matter what, you can build your tracks so that you can fill that in. That's one reason why I do mono sound effects tracks a lot, because I'm actually going to try Mark's way just to see how I like it. But it makes it much easier for me to place that animal exactly where I want that animal, or that footstep, or anything with the objects. I love panning in Atmos versus the channel-based panning, so it gives me a lot more freedom. And I organize all my tracks by, hard effects, regular cinematic effects, and then also, if I have a whole bunch of horses, a section of horses or lizards or whatever it is we do a lot of natural history, whatever we happen to be working with, so that it's easy to group them, as well as just use a VCA for that particular tracks. And I mean, I really like to use a lot of tracks. The guys sometimes tease me about that, but that's just how I like to work. And so I spread everything out so that I can group them instead of having to figure out where everything is. I like just to be able to grab it and go. And it's made it a lot faster, especially on the S6. So.
All right. And you do some special venue projects as well, like immersive museum pieces. Do you primarily mix in your studio, or do you actually go in the field to kind of finish those projects? How do you get them all the way to the finish line?
We do both, actually. We start in the Atmos room. Is actually why I put in an Atmos, is for the museum work that we do. And actually, we're about to start another project for the Aquarium of the Pacific, and they obviously aren't open. So this one client absolutely adores Atmos. He tries to find any way to use it. So it's really awesome. And so he called me at the beginning of the quarantine. He goes, "Do you think we could finish this film in Atmos and send them the 22.6 whatever files it is?" It's like 30 speakers in there. I haven't been there. Jeremy did that mix. And so I said, well, yeah, I think so. It's going to be challenging not being in there, because that's why we go to the theaters, because it's really hard to mix in some time of these bespoke theaters and make sure everything goes right where they are. So we bring our gear, we set it up, and we cal the room, and we go. And then 6 months later, we come back and find that some volunteers pushed the wrong button, and we have to reset everything. But that's exactly what we do, is we start in Atmos in our room, and then we take it in the field and go from there.
The reason in the special venue machine rooms, it's always good to have locked cabinets.
Yeah, it really is.
Mark, kind of the same. Actually, no, I have a question actually from one of the listeners, and you dealing with some of the bigger effects shows, so you probably can give the best guidance. Preparing tracks for Atmos, do you have advice for editors and sound designers working in 5.1 or 7.1 to prep their material for an Atmos mix? Like, do you work closely with sound designers that are going to bring you their sessions that you're then going to mix in terms of how to lay out the tracks?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we've really asked for, one of the bigger difference things we've asked for, is to give us more ambient choices so we can split them out. So if they're giving us 2 or 3 airs, maybe give us 4 or 5, so we have things to split out. But again, once we kind of moved away from working in the old methodology of working on a console and working in the box, it's so much easier now to make anything an object or put it somewhere. So we don't really need them to choose for us. We can kind of do it based on what they send us. But it's definitely, we've asked for definitely some more choices and maybe another layer or two of things.
Yep. Okay. And Tim, you've probably done more channel-based to Atmos remixes than literally anybody in the world, from features to episodic. What do you find challenging or fun about opening up some of those channel-based mixes and seeing what options you have, whether you have full tracks, whether you just have stems, and figuring out how to get them into the Atmos realm? What do you find challenging or fun about those kind of projects?
It's a good question. I'd say of course, having, if I'm going back to stems from an older feature, having effects, a lot of times the stems years ago were mostly delivered by dialogue music effects. Nowadays, of course, now it's more dialogue music effects, Foley backgrounds, for example, or group. And back in those other days, or when they used to just kind of just deliver those three, the effects were always tied. You'd have Foley tied in with all the backgrounds, for example. And you're kind of, there's only so much you can do with that. Granted, Foley's mostly up front, front channels, but you might find there's a lot of too many elements that are tied together. You can't get the separation, which to me is kind of more dangerous on making something inappropriate, because you want the separation to keep it more appropriate, really. So if I have just backgrounds, I could really keep that more in the space and create more of that emotion around you, so that's the other thing. And of course,
sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and then of course, really older features, like we did a Dark Crystal, the original Dark Crystal, and that was I think it was like mono dialogue, a stereo music or something like that, and an LCR of effects or something. I can't remember exactly, but sometimes those older features are really trimmed down.
And I think you said you had an LTRT M&E on top of that, and
yes,
so
that's right. Yeah,
and matching what you had.
Yeah, so decode an LTRT.
Considering the choices you had to work with, it's amazing that you're able to pull that off.
Yeah, Dark Crystal kind of worked out, considering, some of them they work out pretty well, and depends on the studio too that you're working with. Some of them want it more aggressive than others, and you're trying to, of course, at the end of the day, you're always trying to keep the integrity of the original mix. You always have to respect that integrity, and I don't want to unwrap or unravel that by any means.
Yeah, so, that was the follow-up question I was going to ask, is that you have that dual challenge of making it a really exciting Atmos mix, but also for consumers listening in 5.1 or stereo, it still has to be at least a cousin of the original mix. You can't go completely wackadoo in the Atmos and then have a 5.1 or stereo that doesn't reflect what the original creative intent was.
That's actually it's one of the hardest things about doing any catalog work like that, like remixing an older show. Literally the most stressful part about it, by far, bar none, is making the decision of, have I gone too far or am I not doing enough, and finding that dividing line. That is the technology side of it, or whatever, all the creative side of it beyond, is just trying to find out whether it's appropriate. And that's the hardest part.
So for all of you, there's kind of I think an initial notion by some people who are new to working with Atmos that it's, Dolby Atmos equals, sci-fi pew pew and rainstorms and helicopters. We used to joke there need to be rainstorms and helicopters in every Atmos movie. But we're moving beyond that, where it's kind of table stakes in a lot of projects. And I love the fact that Netflix, for example, uses Dolby Atmos on most of their new deliverables these days. And if you watch Chef's Table, it's a foodie documentary, but they said, no, we want that delivered in Dolby Atmos. And there's one scene that I just absolutely loved. I forget which episode, but it's a chef who is out in a rowboat catching shrimp in a river. They live in rivers, oceans, I don't know. Anyway, but she's in a rowboat, and it's just this really delicate, simple wind and crickets and cicadas and water lapping against the boat, but they've put it into this three-dimensional space. And it's that kind of stuff fascinates me, because it doesn't take a lot of time or effort versus doing a 5.1 or even a stereo, but you still get that immersion and that you are there kind of feeling. What are kind of the simpler projects that you've done that that you feel Atmos still contributes to? Cheryl, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. No. That's exactly why I love Atmos, is that makes it I won't say easier, but you can accomplish more in the sound field and the texture, and it does fold down or re-render down to stereo very well. It gives you that much more space to play with. And so the crickets, you know, if you're in that river, you know, the crickets could be across the river and be more, you know, that way, and where close up maybe you're hearing the fish pop, you know, or whatever. And I feel that the intimacy that Atmos allows is what gets overlooked a lot, you know, whether it's in dialogue that's pulled a little bit forward, or, you know, creating that sound space. And it's really, for me, when a director says, or a producer says, oh, that's authentic, that's the biggest compliment, because they were in the field and they heard it and saw it. And so that's really what, for me, is great about Atmos. I really like that.
Okay. Mark, how about you? Do you have do you do the smaller, intimate type projects, or?
Yeah, I mean, we just finished Little Fires Everywhere, which is about, you know, is about as simple as a drama as you can get. It's a lot of character conversations, but we had a wonderful, wonderful score. There were two composers, one of which was Mark Isham, and they delivered me about 30 5/1 splits. And so, you know, I was able to use Atmos for a ton of really just immersive, enveloping stuff. And, you know, in something like that, it actually is almost even a little more powerful because it kind of sneaks up on you, and it's not always going on, but it's very enveloping when it does happen. And yeah, I think it works for that. I think we've learned over the years that with Atmos, just because of the way human hearing works, if there's a lot of things going on, the overhead stuff is kind of hard to discern sometimes, especially when you have loud music and the surrounds and stuff. So I think those moments when we have you know, more subtle stuff, I think it's a lot more powerful, actually.
Well, thank you. Tim?
You know, I was thinking there's a docu-series I worked on recently called Devil Next Door, and that was an Atmos on Netflix. And it, you know, a documentary, and there's some scenes in there where it's based around a courtroom. And it was a makeshift courtroom, and it was a real story of this makeshift courtroom that they had. They almost made it like a news fiasco in a sense. And one of the things the showrunners wanted to do is they really wanted to make it feel large, like make it feel like there's just a lot of people and a lot of commotion in this giant courtroom. So of course we would do that. We'd use the uppers and the whole 7.1 scape around us and build an open space of this courtroom that happens a lot throughout the show, and it really filled out nicely in Atmos. And so that was it. The idea is that of course it brings you in. It's a, you know, it's an emotional thing. It brings you into it. It brings you into the story, you know.
Yeah, cool, thanks. There's, I think, particularly for people who are new to working in Atmos, showrunners or platform executives, there's a little bit of concern about extra time or cost of mixing Atmos versus 5.1. What's been your experience, and what do you see about the actual, you know, kind of labor bill at the end of the day for mixing an Atmos versus a channel-based deliverable? Who'd love to start? So Cheryl, how about you?
It saves me time, actually. Now that I got my head around the tools, it saves me a bunch of time. It's easier to achieve what I want to achieve. And at the end of the day, I can hit my re-render button and go have a glass of wine, come home, come back and go, oh, it's done, and I ship it off and everybody's happy. So for me, it's awesome. I want more of my clients to go Atmos, and I see it happening all the time. So I don't see any big difference between, I mean, creatively, you want to have more fun and spend more time and lay out on it, but that's a different issue. That's not necessarily a budget issue, getting it done.
And Tim, for you, especially doing you know, remixes from channel-based shows in addition to Atmos originals, do you kind of, do they tell you like you got 3 days, or you know what is your workflow in terms of managing creativity versus, you know, whatever your budget is?
Well, as far as time, it depends on the studio, definitely. Some give you a lot of time, some you have a very short period of time to make this work. And but really it's all about, you know, I have so many different presets, so many different templates now, I should say. I have so many of them. So like for a remixing show, I've got Atmos templates, you know, the RMU IO templates and Pro Tools templates for that. I've got, of course, for features, I've got their own templates, documentaries, my own templates. So It's gone to the point now where it's just plug and play as far as which one I'm going to be doing. Five years ago, it was not that way. It was a lot harder because I'd have to kind of restructure everything before I'd start a project. Now it's like, oh, I bring in the new template, plop, stick it in, go.
Okay, cool. And Mark, how's the experience been for you? You think?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've had to do with showrunners and producers is just educating them on what it is. And I think as the shows start, it's really like, okay, this is what it sounds like in Atmos, and this is what it sounds like in 5.1, and trying to show them what the differences are between that. But almost exclusively everybody I've worked with, once you kind of have done that for a couple shows, they just get comfortable. They just want to listen in Atmos. But as far as time and budgeting, we actually really the only time that we're adding extra is just for making the DAMF. And we like to do that on the stage just to make sure that, the metadata is playing back properly and all that stuff. We don't send it somewhere else that somebody that hadn't heard it wouldn't know. But, that takes an hour at the end of the last day of a mix. And so it really hasn't taken any more time to do deliverables or anything else like that. And people have been pretty happy with that part of it. They haven't had to add days or a ton of extra money.
Okay, great. So I think in the early days of Atmos, and Tim, you probably had more experience with this than just about anyone. Sometimes the showrunners or post executives are kind of dragged kicking and screaming into the format. The streaming platform or the disc producer says, we need an Atmos mix. And the showrunner is kind of, but my art, my storytelling, they're afraid that it's going to be distractive versus more immersive or bringing people, farther into the story as a storytelling aid. What's been your experience and kind of how do you earn the trust that Atmos does enhance the storytelling instead of just distract from it? What's kind of been the journey with you and some of the creatives that you work with?
It's, most of the people and most of the filmmakers and showrunners, when they come in, it's once they hear it, they're usually cool with it. They understand what you're doing, especially if you're not trying to make it gimmicky. If you're just making it nice sounding and they're usually pretty good about it for the most part. I've only had a couple of people, literally only a couple of people, a couple of producers that were kicking and screaming pretty much the whole way through. But that's just because they had horse blinders on and they just didn't want to see it. They didn't want to move ahead with it. And but I'll tell you a quick thing on Okja, the director Bong Joon-ho. He
did Parasite recently.
He did Parasite. We did Okja when I did it on my own at first. Because he was overseas at the time, and the other producers and some of the people on the crew were saying, you might want to be more conservative with it. He might not want it to go too crazy. So I actually made two versions of it. I made one that's a little more conservative, and then I made another one where I just kind of went more wild. And the moment he walked into the room for playback, after just talking, I hadn't even hit play yet, just talking to him, and he's looking around and going, oh yeah, so you can use these speakers for this, we could really move things around and have this opened up. I didn't even play him the conservative mix, at that point. I just played him the full mix, and he was like, there it is. In fact, he wanted to go even further. So it's just getting them to hear it, then it's good. And especially, and also knowing that it'll down mix down to 5.1. There are people that want to make sure that happens, and so knowing that it's going to down mix and they're going to hear it down on their iPhones and their iPads on their earbuds correctly.
Yeah. And Mark, have you had creative concerns or any kind of back and forth with what you'd like to do versus people in this, the desk behind you going, pull it back?
Yeah, never the pull it back, but sometimes it's trying to start different things. I know on Power Rangers, we did some things with dialogue where we put them as objects and it just didn't work as well. So we put them back in the surrounds but it's just having those conversations and trying different things. Haven't had anybody kicking and screaming, and there have been a lot of new showrunners and producers, and they're just kind of excited about the process. They're really happy to do it, and so they don't have a lot of the old creative baggage of things. And we spent so many years trying to make sure that what we were taking from the dub stage would translate to theaters, and that's still a concern, obviously. But I think that that's a mindset that a lot of people that we're working with today that are showrunners or associate producers or producers don't necessarily have. And so they're a lot more open to it. And I think it's always about just making sure you're respectful of, you're still trying to tell a story, right? I mean, dialogue's always king and doing that. Haven't been, I can't remember the last time we had a conversation where it was, oh, that's too much.
Good to hear. Cheryl, what's been your experience, particularly with people who are used to doing strictly linear broadcast type deliverables, and then going into the streaming world where Atmos is a possibility, or maybe home video releases?
I've only had very positive experiences. Most of the people I work with are very excited to move forward. Sometimes it's the people that are making the money decisions or their superiors that are harder to get in, because they're not in the room with you experiencing it and understanding what's going on. Sometimes it's the execs, especially in the broadcast or OTT world, that, oh, we'll just do 5.1. We've always done 5.1. So it's kind of, it's hard, a little harder to push that envelope, but I'm always pushing that envelope. But the people who are actually in the room doing the content, it's hands down the way they want to work.
Yeah,
it really
great.
is.
All right, cool. That's actually all my questions. We have about 15 minutes left, and we have a bunch of questions from our attendees. Let's do speed round. So this is a good one. And is it useful for sound designers to start Atmos panning if they're using Dolby Atmos Production Suite before the mix stage? What are your preferences? Do you like the sound designers who will bring you your final mixes to have already programmed in some three-dimensional moves, or do you want them to just build the sound palette and then you do all the actual mixing? I guess how much pre-mixing comes to you already done is the question.
On our end, we haven't had any. We're not having, nobody's doing any of that stuff. Most of the edit rooms are still 5.1, some of them are 7.1. So we haven't really had that happen. And I would obviously always take anything from any sound designer or sound editor. I do think one of the things to be mindful of is, especially in Pro Tools, the panners act so differently in 5.1 versus 7.1 versus Atmos, that I think it's hard, unless you really have a well set up proportioned room, to know how that's going to translate into a bigger space. But that being said, we haven't had anybody delivering us anything that's been pre-panned. And one of the reasons about that, Tom, one of the things that's hard in the workflow is, then you really have to coordinate how you're going to set up the RMU and how the outputs of the Pro Tools are going to be and what objects you're going to use in your object budget. So we just haven't seen that coming from editorial.
Yep. Okay. And Tim, how about your perspective on that?
Very similar to Mark, really, very similar. It's just, most people cut, if they know I'm going in, it's going to end up in Atmos. If they have a 7.1 room, I'll say, okay, well, cut in 7.1, especially like backgrounds and things, do side surrounds and rear surrounds if you can. If you have the capability of doing so in your edit room, and then I usually say, then I'll take it from there. I'll take it to Atmos from there. And as Mark said, I mean, of course, if they give me something in Atmos, or they give me something where it's already pre-planned for things to be in upper channels, yeah, I'll take it. But I'm not seeing a lot of that yet.
Okay. Yeah. This is a great question. What are your favorite upmixing or three-dimensional expansion plugins that you like to use? Cheryl, what's in your arsenal typically?
I use a combination of a lot of different things. I really actually try not to upmix. I try to spatialize with stems or whatever without the upmix. But if I'm upmixing, I'll use the New Gen Halo. I also really like the AnyMix, the Sonics AnyMix a lot, but that's not, it doesn't have the Atmos capabilities yet. And then I also have been playing around with something called SPAT. And I really like to use SPAT for music mixing and different things that I really want to get spatialized a lot, because you can model your own how you do it, and that's really very cool. It's a little limiting, but it's very cool when you get it to work right. So those are the three tools I lean on a lot.
Mm-hmm. And Mark?
The only upmixer I use is Pentio. And I'll use it on stereo music, but I'll usually only use it in 7.1. I find that taking even a stereo to 5.1 or 7.1 can kind of stretch how much artifacting you get. But doing that, and then a lot of times I'll use some reverb and stuff to get up top if we need to, or sometimes I'll take the back surrounds and fold them up top. But a lot of times I'll use Slapper for delays, or any of the exponential reverbs that are doing the 714 or 912 reverbs. But yeah, just like Cheryl too, as long as I have stems, I'm usually a lot happier with that, with score and stuff. And a lot of people are delivering that now. It's very rare we're getting stuck with any stereo mixes on music.
Okay, Tim, how about you? What are your favorite toys?
Like Cheryl and Mark said, definitely stems are of course the way to go. But if upmixing, I've used Halo a few times, but I usually am not using just Halo. I'll use Halo, and then I might have another, like a slap delay or another reverb, going to the back or something. A lot of times I won't even use an upmix plugin. I'll use a couple different reverbs and delays, stereo ones, and then pan them in different areas. Reverb up top, delay in the back, let's say, just as an idea. And then, and because I haven't really heard any Atmos reverbs, if you will, or 712 reverbs that just are, upmixes on their own that really doesn't, I'm worried that it's going to sound too synthetic sitting over your head like that. So I always want to create more depth. That's what I'm trying to do. So that's why I use stuff.
Okay. I know you trust the rooms that you mix in, but here's an interesting question. When you're mixing, particularly for broadcast, do you ever check it in a consumer environment? Like the latest Atmos renderer, a mastering suite and production suite, you have that export to MP4 option. So once you have your master file, you can encode it, with a one click. You have the encode it to Dolby Digital Plus, wrap it in an MP4 container, and then you put it on a thumb drive to stick it in your TV or Blu-ray player. Is that something you go to just to hear how it actually does translate to a mainstream consumer Atmos soundbar, or even right out of a television? Who wants to start? Cheryl.
Well, you found my next project. I think that question was like 2 years ago. I was like, can I do this? And you were like, yeah, I don't think so. But that's actually the plan for my basement studio, is to have that, be able to do that right there. Like I'm in the studio and then I go to my home setup and I listen A/B it right there. Because I also feel that is actually where I want to go with remote reviews. This is why I want to do it, is test a high-end soundbar and see how it does with like Streambox, with that, because Streambox is Atmos capable, and then send the stream, somehow learn how to send the stream to this soundbar, so that if a client is not able to come into the studio for whatever reason, COVID or whatever, I can ship this soundbar, set up, try to make it work. I mean, this is Pollyanna, I know, but I think that especially in today's world, this is where we're all going, and workflows are global now. It's not just I'm going to be in Hollywood, I go to the soundstage. No offense, guys, but I mean, I think that we need to be able to do that, and that allows you to do that. So I'm very excited about it. It's my next step in my basement. So I'm just taking a little breather, and I'll let you know how it goes. And that's what I want to do, is be able to send clients, this is how you set it up. This is what we do. Here's your Streambox node. Okay, here you go. And then the review is 1 or 2 milliseconds apart. So I want to actually get away from rendering to the MP4. I want to do an actual stream.
Okay, wow. We have a question about room setups. Just real quick, are you all mixing 7.1 with 4 overheads, or is anyone using a higher speaker count in their near field Atmos mix room, like specifically left wide, right wide, like a 914 or 916?
Well, I mean, the film we're doing now, we're actually mixing in the biggest stage here, which I think is, I want to say it's 38 channels of theatrical Atmos. But so we did we started our final in just one of our 714 rooms. So we kind of have a variety of different, rooms for it. But that's one of the great things, is it doesn't matter what room you're in, it just it just plays. So yeah, I would say a majority of the broadcast rooms in town that are Atmos set up now, and I think, Tim, we have 13 mix stages here, and I think 11 of them are all Atmos. A majority of them are still 714 rooms, a couple of 916 rooms, and the couple feature stages. But I would say a majority of the work, and this is having been to a lot of the other facilities in town too, are 714 setups.
Yep.
And it's just getting people educated too, that It's really making sure you understand that it doesn't matter what the playback system is. I'll always use front wides even when I can't hear them in the room. We'll do that stuff, but a majority of it's been 714.
Okay. I think just one more question. And we hate to get into the mindset of Atmos equals overheads. You have to put stuff up there, otherwise it's not Atmos-y. We have a question asking, please explain the use of overhead channels specifically for ambience versus music tracks versus reverb. Like, do you ever send dialogue reverb to overhead, or what do you find most useful to actually expand into that Z-axis? Tim, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's interesting. As you're just saying, Tom, it's not just about the overheads. Definitely not. I mean, Atmos is about the sides and the rears and the dimension that you're filling all in between. It's not just the top. So but as far as a question, like if you're putting a reverb to dialogue in the heights, it depends on the scene. If they're in a cave or something, or a big church, then of course. Or what I was talking about earlier with the Devil Next Door in the courtroom. We put reverbs and delays all over the whole space. So we'll definitely use them. Music, I'll definitely put things in the top channels if it's fluid, like reverby kind of, fluid kind of stuff. But yeah.
Okay. Cheryl, how about you?
Yeah, exactly the same. I feel like, when you're first starting out, you feel like you kind of in your head, you go, it's 7.1 or 9.1 with the overheads. And then as you start mixing, you dive into the objects and the sound field and being able to really play with the reverbs and different stems and everything. It just becomes part of the sound field. It's not something that you go, oh, I got to do it in the overheads. Of course, unless it's rain, right? So, I mean, it's just a general maturity in how you think and how you approach the mix versus, when you first start out. I was saying last night how when I went back to look at older projects, I could just see the progression of my mind and how I just started thinking about it differently. So I wouldn't think, oh, overheads. I would just think immersion. I don't know.
To go a little further on that too, sometimes reviewers on whether it's Blu-ray or online, streaming content of people that review the work, a lot of times you'll see a lot of people talk about how much info is in the top channels. And I tend to kind of snicker at that a little bit. It's not all about that, and so I kind of have to, not get upset about that.
Right. And Mark, what are your feelings on it?
Yeah, I mean, I try if we're talking about dialogue ambiances and stuff, I'll usually just only put reverb and stuff up there. Again, what Tim said, I mean, my biggest thing about mixing that is in Atmos is really having the 7.1 beds. I mean, I use the surrounds a lot more and a lot differently in Atmos because of that. And so if I'm going to use delays and stuff, I'll usually tend to leave them on the base layer and do that. And if I'm going to move dialogue up to the top, it will actually be the discrete dialogue. If I want something to whip overhead or do something interesting, I'll do it with that. But usually it's just reverb and some environmental stuff.
Okay, cool, thanks. That's all the time we have for questions. I apologize for those of you that we didn't get to them. We do have more sessions coming up in the future, as well as one that happened last week. Let me do a little bit of housekeeping here, put up my screen. So last week, there's a brand new Netflix piece called Sol Levante. It is the very first Dolby Atmos and Dolby Vision HDR anime, hand-drawn anime, and it's just a 4-minute piece, but it's currently on Netflix. It was mixed by Will Files and Matt Yoakum, and last week's webinar was talking about how they did that mix, and Ozzy Sutherland contributed from Netflix as well. And attendees, get out your cell phones so that you can snap some QR codes, because number one, we will have that webinar available for playback shortly, but also here are some takeaways for you. So first of all, Dolby Atmos Production Suite is our lightweight Atmos renderer tool. And if you click that QR code, it'll send you to the Dolby Professional website, where you can register for a 1-month free demo of Production Suite. So you can actually start playing around with Dolby Atmos mixes literally on a laptop. And Netflix has also generously posted the Sol Levante mix assets, the Pro Tools session, the master files, and so you can actually download that from the Netflix file sharing website from that second QR code. And then you can actually play with the mix and remix it yourself to your heart's content with that content and with the Atmos production suite. 2 other pieces, one on YouTube about the sound of Solovante, and then a Netflix tech blog article that are also about that piece. And again, that webinar was a week ago, and it's going to go on our Go to Stage website very shortly, and we're going to send you all an email with the link to that website. Next week, whoever joins us next week are going to be stuck listening just to me for a solid hour. So my webinar, Dolby Atmos, How and Why, same time next week. And it's basically knowledge about the overall Dolby Atmos content as well as consumer electronics ecosystems, so that you as creative people can have those why should I do Atmos conversations with creatives, with post-production executives, with streaming platform folks. And I'll also give a high-level demonstration of the Dolby Atmos mixing and mastering tools. And click to the next slide. And there's the QR code to register for that webinar. So again, that's next week this time. And it's a PowerPoint presentation of the overall consumer and content ecosystems. And then I'll actually launch Pro Tools and the Dolby Atmos production suite on my laptop. And I'll walk you through what a Dolby Atmos Pro Tools session looks like and just all of the high level features of the Dolby Atmos production suite renderer. So 9:01, I went a minute over. Cheryl, Mark, Tim, thank you all so much for your time. I had a lot of fun doing this. I hope you did too. All of our attendees that came on, we had a couple hundred of you. Thank you all very, very much. And we'll have this live on our GoToWebinar site shortly. But thank you all very much and have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Tim.